Well, hello everyone. My name's Bill Barker. Some of you might have heard of me as someone who had quite a bit to do with the original development of the concept of National Human Rights Action Plans. Well, it's great to have this opportunity to give you a sense of what it was behind the original idea and how it unfolded in those early years. It would have been nice to have been with you in person, but Liverpool's a long way from where I live on the southeast coast of Australia. I'd like to thank Dr. Azadeh Chalabi, partly for inviting me to speak, but much more for the outstanding work she's done over recent years in expanding the theoretical basis for action plans, and also for analysing the experience of how action plans have been developed in various countries, their strengths and their failings. It's a source of satisfaction to me to know that there's a person of such intellect and talent guiding work on national action plans today. Thanks so much, Azi. And it's even better to know that a global network has been set up that will enable people across the world to share good practices, understand challenges, and develop ways of dealing with them. And also that this involves governments, NGOs, universities, and international organisations. As you know, action plans came out of the 1993 World Conference on Human Rights in Vienna. Well, that was a long, long time ago. And for some people, it's hard to imagine what things were like then. In a way, you had to actually be there. The political situation in Europe changed almost overnight, quite dramatically. Everyone was readjusting to a world without the Soviet bloc. Some people even started to think that a new world might be possible, where cooperation rather than hostility might prevail. But at the same time, there were plenty of less positive things going on, which were a reminder of how difficult change could be. This was brought home to me and others forcefully as we struggled with the preparations for the World Conference. The work leading up to the Vienna Declaration was done largely in a preparatory committee, which met several times in Geneva starting in 1991. I was deeply involved in that work. Now, much has faded from memory since then, but I remember that these meetings were basically a horrible experience, with even the simplest step forward being seemingly too difficult for many of the participants. After listening to pointless squabbling for hours and hours, I was getting decidedly frustrated with the whole thing. I started to search around for something, anything, that could be put forward with an expectation of broad support. Now, I can actually remember the moment that the idea of National Human Rights Action Plans came into my head. And I don't think I've actually talked about this before. But one day I was just chatting with an Australian colleague in his office just down the corridor from my own. I did human rights while he did environment. And he was working on the preparations for the 1992 Rio World Conference on Environment and Development. He mentioned in passing that countries were working on environment-related action plans that could be presented to the Rio conference. And I thought, action plans. Why couldn't we do something like that in the field of human rights? Well, I went away and thought about it a bit more. And the more I thought about it, the more sensible the idea seemed. Sure, there's a sense in which human rights involves peremptory norms, but there's obviously more to changing behaviours than just saying, oh, you can't do this or you must do that. For governments to actually bring about change, there's a need for the usual processes of administration to be employed. All those mundane tasks such as establishing institutions and finding resources, talking to communities, finding the right people, setting targets, having monitoring mechanisms so that you could measure progress and engaging with the media and other things. Well, I went away and drafted something up, just 2 or 3 pages, sketching out what a proposal for the Human Rights Conference might contain on national action plans. I had a few basics in mind. First, such a plan had to be completely voluntary for states. It shouldn't be the result of any kind of coercion. Second, each country's plan would start from the actual situation the country was in. obviously keeping economic and institutional capacity in mind. And third, the action plan approach should apply to all, because every country could improve. And I listed a few possible elements that such a plan might contain. I then went around and started discussing the idea with representatives of other countries. Most of those I talked to saw merit in the step-by-step approach. I wouldn't say they were filled with enthusiasm about it, but the general reaction was reasonably positive. Not everyone was supportive, of course. Some weren't interested because they saw it as just another Western example of putting pressure on them. Others because they had no intention of doing anything on human rights anyway. And at the other end of the spectrum, there were some Western countries who didn't like the idea because it seemed to embody a sense of gradualism or relativism. And that might allow some countries to get away with poor human rights performance. And others, somewhat amazingly, didn't like the idea because they thought they'd already achieved a near perfect record on human rights and it was pointless to plan to do any more. But these negative voices were together, I think, just a fairly small minority. Now, originally I had the idea that each state that prepared an action plan would actually present it to the World Conference, so that taken together they would represent a substantial set of human rights commitments by the international community in 1993. But alas, this was too much to expect from the preparatory committee. A practical, matter-of-fact approach such as this wasn't going to be the centrepiece of the World Conference's outcomes. So we, that is Australia, ensured that the National Human Rights Action Plan was on the table for the preparatory committee, and it was duly adopted by the committee in May 1993 in the form that you find it in that's familiar to you from the Vienna Declaration, paragraph 71. Now, as far as I was concerned, by this stage I'd moved on. I wasn't in Geneva anymore. My posting had come to an end in 1992, and I was feeling a bit burned out by years of work on human rights and the United Nations, and I found something else to do for a few years. So I didn't go to Vienna, but I did have the satisfaction of seeing national action plans endorsed there. Now, what I hadn't really focused on at the time, and I guess that was because I originally viewed the action plans as something that would be prepared for the conference, but what I hadn't focused on was that in the formulation finally adopted, there was an obvious obligation on Australia as the country that had actually put forward the idea to develop an action plan for itself. Otherwise, we would have looked rather hypocritical. But in Canberra, I watched on as others put together the National Action Plan. And I have to say, this was done in a bit of a hurry because it was felt necessary to get it done by the time of the next meeting of the Commission on Human Rights, which was in early 1994. Now, the Australian plan was the first ever plan, and I have to admit it wasn't all that great. But it was a start, and it got the ball rolling. It was reasonably comprehensive. It acknowledged that Australia had work to do on human rights, and it was endorsed at the highest level of government in Australia. And after that, it was interesting to see other plans begin to appear in places all over the world in the years that followed. Those plans were extremely varied in their content and structure, but that wasn't surprising. There was no guidance or suggested format on how to go about this. It was noticeable that the idea of human rights action plans appealed in particular to countries in transition, of which there were quite a few at that time. I'm not sure if any of these plans had a significant impact at the time, but at least in many cases they required a wider range of government officials to be talking about and considering human rights as one of their responsibilities. And in some cases it brought governments and NGOs closer together. Now, because there was an obvious international interest in the action plan concept, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights became involved. In the late 1990s, the office approached me and asked if I would be interested in writing a training manual on national action plans. By this time, I'd left the diplomatic service and set myself up as a kind of a consultant on human rights, working on things like training and policy advice and so on. So naturally I agreed to this proposal and launched into drafting what appeared in 2002 as the Handbook on National Human Rights Action Plans. In keeping with the original concept, my approach in the handbook was to suggest to readers that plans should be very practical. Indeed, I always felt that if the concept led people to talk more productively about human rights at all levels of government and society, and actually to try to do something without risking condemnation and without seeking personal gain, this would be a positive outcome in itself. The handbook had its shortcomings and is now a bit out of date, particularly in the optimistic assessment of the direction of international relations. Also, I relied almost entirely on my own experience as a government official and human rights advocate for the content of the book. I probably shouldn't admit it, but I don't think I did any research at all as to what others might have done in the field of the planning and on what might work and what didn't. But I felt at the time, and I still feel, that the ideas set out in the handbook are a good basis for maximising chances of success. In other words, establishing competent organisations to manage the process, setting goals, employing monitoring mechanisms, consulting widely, empowering people, being open and informative, ensuring reasonable resources, involving political leadership, engaging with the international community, along with a few other principles, which I guess brings me full circle to where I was nearly 35 years ago. It would have been good if there'd been a network such as yours to facilitate the sharing of experience and ideas and allowing for mutual encouragement. But better late than never. I'm excited to think about the discussions you're going to have over the next few days. It looks like a really significant event to me, and it shows the Human Rights Action Plan process is alive and well. I wish you every success for the workshop and for the future development of the network. Thanks for the opportunity to talk to you today.